The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. Let's talk about money. Not in the way your bank talks about it, not the way a financial advisor talks about it with charts and percentages and a very rehearsed smile, but in the real, messy, human way. The way that explains why some incredibly smart people go broke, and why some people who barely finished high school end up retiring comfortably at 62 with a paid-off house and zero stress. That's the central mystery that Morgan Housel spends this entire book trying to solve. And his answer, which he arrives at slowly and beautifully across 20 chapters, is this: your financial outcomes have very little to do with how smart you are, and almost everything to do with how you behave. That's a humbling thing to sit with. We like to think of money as a math problem. If I earn X and save Y% and invest Z dollars, I should get this result. But Housel's argument is that money isn't a math problem at all. It's a psychology problem. And the sooner we accept that, the better chance we have at getting it right. So let's walk through this book together, all of it. The ideas, the stories, the lessons, and the things that might quietly change how you think about every financial decision you make for the rest of your life. Part 1. And no one's crazy. The first thing Housel wants you to understand is that the way you think about money isn't irrational. It's just the product of your specific life experience. And your life experience is different from everyone else's. He opens with a striking illustration. Someone who grew up during the Great Depression watched people lose everything overnight. Banks failed. Jobs vanished. Savings disappeared. That person is going to carry a bone-deep fear of debt and instability for the rest of their life. They're going to keep cash under the mattress. They're going to avoid the stock market. And if you tell them that the stock market has historically returned 7 to 10% annually, they're going to look at you like you just offered them candy from a stranger. Now contrast that with someone born in, say, 1975, who grew up during a long bull market, watched their parents' 401k grow steadily for decades, and only experienced the 2008 crash as an adult when they had enough resilience to weather it. That person is going to see investing completely differently. They're going to be more comfortable with risk, more patient, more willing to stay in the market during downturns. Both people are being completely rational given their own experiences. But their financial behaviors are almost opposite. And here's the important part. Neither of them is crazy. This matters because we spend a lot of time judging other people's financial decisions without understanding the context that shaped them. Why does your uncle keep his retirement money in savings accounts earning nothing? Probably because the one time he trusted the market, it hurt him. Why does your 25-year-old colleague pour money into crypto? Because every signal they've received tells them that traditional institutions aren't trustworthy and that betting on the unconventional is how fortunes are made. Understanding this doesn't mean every decision is equally good. But it means judgment has to start with empathy, not contempt. Part 2. Luck and Risk. The twins we ignore. This is one of the most important and most uncomfortable chapters in the book. Housel wants us to confront something our brains really don't want to accept. The people we admire most for their financial success are not purely the products of their own brilliance and hard work. Luck played a role. And the people we quietly judge for their financial failure are not purely the products of bad decisions. Risk played a role. He uses Bill Gates as his primary example. Bill Gates, as a teenager in 1968, attended Lakeside School in Seattle, one of the only high schools in the entire world that had a computer at the time. Not a computer lab, a computer. The odds of being a teenager in 1968 who had access to a computer were astronomically small. Gates happened to be one of them. He then spent thousands of hours learning to code at an age when most kids didn't even know computers existed. Was Gates brilliant? Absolutely. Did he work extraordinarily hard? No question. But he also got extraordinarily lucky. And Housel makes the uncomfortable observation that there were probably thousands of people just as brilliant and just as hardworking as Gates who never had that access and never became billionaires. His friend Ken Evans, who was by all accounts as talented as Gates, died in a mountaineering accident before he ever got to see what he might have become. That's risk. Pure, cruel, indifferent risk. What do we do with this information? Housel isn't saying success is random or that effort doesn't matter. He's saying that when we evaluate outcomes, our own and others, we need to hold two truths simultaneously. Effort matters enormously, and so does luck. The problem is we can't always tell which is which. This should make us more humble about our own successes. It should make us less cruel about others' failures. And it should make us deeply cautious about copying any one person's financial strategy, because what worked for them might have worked partly because of circumstances that will never apply to you. Part 3. Never enough. Here's a question. How much money is enough? Housel tells the story of a party thrown by a billionaire hedge fund manager on Shelter Island. Two guests at the party were authors Kurt Vonnegut and Joseph Heller. Vonnegut pointed out to Heller that their host had made more money in a single day than Heller had earned from his novel Catch, 22 across its entire life. Heller smiled and said something like, "I have something he'll never have enough." The inability to feel like you have enough is one of the most dangerous financial conditions a person can have. And it's surprisingly common at every income level. Housel points to people who have lost everything, not to bad investments, but to the pursuit of more. Executives at Enron who had millions, who were set for life, who threw it all away chasing returns that would have made their net worth go from extraordinary to slightly more extraordinary. For what? The problem is that the goalpost moves. You set a target, if I just had $100,000 I'd be fine, and then you get there, and the target shifts. Now it's $1 million. Then it's $5 million. Then it's $100 million. The person running that race never wins, because the finish line is always moving. Housel's prescription is to decide what enough looks like for you, not compared to the person next to you, but in absolute terms. What would make your life feel full? What level of security would let you sleep at night? And then, radically stop when you get there. Don't keep risking what you have and need for what you don't have and probably won't need. This sounds obvious. It is not easy. Part 4. The miracle nobody appreciates. Compounding. Let's talk about the most powerful force in personal finance, and also the most consistently underestimated, compound interest. You've probably heard about compound interest before. You probably nodded along when someone explained it. But Housel's argument is that despite knowing about it intellectually, most of us don't truly feel its power in our gut, and because of that, we make decisions that work against it. Here's his most powerful illustration. Warren Buffett is worth somewhere north of $80 billion. He is, by every measure, one of the greatest investors in history. But here's the thing most people don't talk about. Buffett started investing when he was 10 years old. He got his first brokerage account as a teenager. He didn't stop. Ever. By his 30th birthday, he already had $1 million. By 65, he had around $3.4 billion. But approximately 95% of his net worth was accumulated after his 65th birthday. Let that land for a moment. The vast majority of Warren Buffett's wealth didn't come from being a genius investor in his prime. It came from being a pretty good investor for an extraordinarily long time. Now imagine, and this is Housel's hypothetical, that Buffett had been a normal investor in his 20s, had discovered his investing passion at age 30 instead of 10, or had retired at 65 to enjoy his wealth. With the same skill and percentage returns, just starting later or stopping sooner, his net worth might be a fraction of what it is. The lesson isn't invest more. The lesson is invest earlier and never stop. Time is the engine. Your investment decisions are just the fuel. Without time, even great fuel doesn't get you far. And yet, how many of us delay starting? How many people in their 30s think, I'll get serious about saving when I'm making more money? How many people in their 40s think, it's probably too late for me to start? Housel's answer to both is, start now and don't stop. Part 5. Getting wealthy versus staying wealthy. Here's a distinction that seems obvious once you hear it, but that almost no one acts on. The skills required to get rich are almost the opposite of the skills required to stay rich. Getting rich generally requires optimism. You have to believe an opportunity is real, that a risk is worth taking, that the future will be better than the past. You have to be willing to make concentrated bets. You have to be comfortable being wrong sometimes in pursuit of being very right once. Staying rich requires something closer to the opposite. It requires humility. Paranoia, almost. The recognition that the same boldness that made you wealthy can also destroy you if you let it run unchecked. It requires frugality. not as deprivation, but as a deep appreciation that the money you have is more valuable than the money you might make. Housel points to the many cases of people who built enormous wealth and then lost it, not because they stopped being smart, but because they kept taking the same kinds of risks that made them successful in the first place. They couldn't shift gears. They kept swinging for home runs when what they needed was to protect the lead they'd built. The most financially resilient people are not necessarily the boldest. They're the ones who know when to be bold and when to be cautious. And they never, under any circumstances, put themselves in a position where a single bad outcome, a failed investment, an economic crash, a health crisis, can wipe them out entirely. This is why Housel argues that survival is the ultimate financial skill. It's not glamorous. It doesn't make for impressive dinner party conversation. But the investor who stays in the market for 40 years through every crash and correction, who never panics, who never gets wiped out, who just keeps going, that person will almost always outperform the brilliant strategist who gets taken out by a single catastrophic event. Part 6. Tails. You win here is one of the most counterintuitive ideas in the book, and it's one that should genuinely relieve a lot of anxiety. Failure is normal, expected, mathematically inevitable. Housel borrows a concept from statistics and venture capital called tail events. In any distribution of outcomes, the extremes, the tails, are rare. Most outcomes cluster in the middle. But in investing, most of the gains come from a very small number of tail events, the rare, enormous winners that more than compensate for everything else. He uses the example of Amazon. Amazon has launched countless products and services over its history. Many of them failed. Remember the Fire Phone? Most people don't because it was a disaster. But Prime and AWS succeeded so dramatically that they more than covered every failure Amazon ever had, and then some. The same is true for venture capital funds, for stock portfolios, and for individual careers. The implication is powerful. You don't need everything to work. You need a few things to work spectacularly. And the price of access to those spectacular wins is tolerating a lot of ordinary losses along the way. This changes how you should think about failure. A bad investment isn't necessarily evidence of a bad strategy. A product that flops isn't necessarily evidence of poor judgment. If you're taking smart, diversified risks, some of them will fail. That's not a problem. It's a sign the system is working. The mistake is concluding that because something failed, you should stop trying. The mistake is pulling your money out of the market after a bad year, or abandoning a career experiment after a first rejection. The winners in investing are almost always the people who stayed in the game long enough for the tails to do their work. Part 7. Freedom. Housel pauses here to ask a genuinely important question. What is money actually for? And his answer is beautiful in its simplicity. Money is for freedom. Specifically, the freedom to control your own time. He cites research on happiness, the finding that autonomy, the ability to make choices about how you spend your time, is one of the most consistent predictors of human well-being. Not wealth itself. Not status. Not possessions. The experience of being able to decide what you do and when you do it. Think about the things that make people genuinely unhappy in their work lives. It's rarely the work itself. It's the commute they didn't choose, the meeting they were forced into, the project they were assigned without input, the deadline that was imposed without discussion. It's the loss of control. And money, specifically enough money to have options, is the antidote. Housel makes a distinction here between two kinds of wealth. There's the kind you can see, the car, the house, the clothes, the vacations. And then there's the kind you can't see, the financial cushion that means you could say no to a job you hate, or take 6 months to figure out your next move, or stay home with a sick child without panicking about the paycheck. The second kind is dramatically more valuable. But we spend most of our money on the first kind because the second kind is invisible. Nobody sees your savings account. Everybody sees your car. The happiest people Housel describes aren't the richest. They're the people who've arranged their financial lives so that they have genuine control over how they spend their days. That's the goal. Not the number in the account, the life the account makes possible. Part 8. Man in the CAR Paradox. This chapter is short and devastating. Housel asks you to imagine seeing someone driving a beautiful, expensive sports car. What do you think about that person? If you're honest, you probably think something like, wow, they must be successful. I'd love to have that car. I'd look pretty great driving that. Notice what you're not thinking. What an impressive, admirable person. You're not thinking about them at all. You're thinking about yourself. You're imagining yourself in their position. Now here's the point. The person who bought that car almost certainly bought it hoping others would think they were impressive. But nobody's thinking that. Everyone who sees that car is having the same self-referential thought you just had. This is the paradox. We spend money on status symbols hoping to earn admiration. But admiration isn't what we receive. We receive a kind of envy that's focused entirely on the car, not on us. We're basically invisible. This isn't just about cars. It's about everything we buy to signal success. The watch, the neighborhood, the private school, the restaurant. Much of it is purchased in the hope that it will make others think well of us. And it mostly doesn't work, not because people aren't impressed, but because their impression of the object doesn't translate into genuine respect for the person. Housel's conclusion: if you want respect and admiration, the path is humility, kindness, and genuine usefulness, not possessions. Paradoxically, the person who drives a modest car and is known for their generosity tends to be admired far more genuinely than the person in the sports car. Part 9. Wealth is what you don't see. Following directly from the previous chapter, Housel makes this argument. We have a wildly distorted picture of what wealth actually looks like. When we imagine a wealthy person, we picture conspicuous consumption. The big house, the nice clothes, the fancy vacations. But this is backwards. True wealth isn't what you've spent. It's what you haven't spent. It's the assets that haven't been converted into things. The person who drives a 10-year-old Honda Civic and lives in a modest house might have $2 million in a retirement account. You'd never know. The person in the Mercedes with the waterfront home might have zero net worth and a mountain of debt. You'd never know that either. We make assumptions about people's financial situations based on their spending. But spending and wealth are inversely related. The more you spend, the less wealth you accumulate. The more you save and invest, the more wealth you build. Wealth that, by definition, you can't see because it hasn't been converted into things yet. Housel's point is that we need to stop measuring financial success by visible consumption and start measuring it by the invisible accumulation of options, security, and freedom. Part 10. Save money. This chapter is almost disarmingly simple. Housel's message: save money. Save money even when you don't have a specific plan for it. Save money not for retirement or a house or a car. Just save it. The reason isn't that you'll definitely need it for something specific. The reason is that having savings gives you flexibility and resilience. It means that when life, which is unpredictable and frequently chaotic, throws something unexpected at you, you have options. You don't have to take the first job offered because you need the paycheck. You don't have to stay in a bad situation because you can't afford to leave. You don't have to sell your investments at the worst possible time because you need cash. He makes the point that in a world that changes constantly and unpredictably, the ability to adapt is one of the most valuable things you can have. And savings buy adaptability. They buy optionality. They buy the ability to say no. Saving money doesn't require a high income. It requires spending less than you earn. That sounds obvious, but the culture we live in works against it constantly. We are surrounded by messages telling us to spend. Buy this, upgrade this, treat yourself to that. The counterintuitive act of choosing not to spend, of being somewhat immune to consumption culture, is both financially and psychologically powerful. And Housel notes something important. You don't need a specific reason to save. I'm saving for retirement, or I'm saving for a down payment are fine. But I'm saving because having money gives me options and security and peace of mind is just as valid and maybe more durable as a motivation. Part 11. Reasonable is better than rational. Here's where the book gets really honest about human nature. Purely rational financial behavior is, for most people, impossible to sustain. The rational move might be to hold a perfectly diversified global index fund portfolio with an optimal allocation based on your age and risk tolerance. never touching it regardless of market conditions, and rebalancing mechanically every year. In theory, perfect. In practice, impossible because markets fall, fear takes over, and the rational plan meets the irrational human. Housel's advice: aim for reasonable, not rational. Make financial decisions you can actually stick to, even if they're not mathematically optimal. His example: some people feel emotionally better holding some amount of cash even when investing that cash would theoretically produce better returns. A purely rational analysis says this is a mistake. But if having that cash buffer means you don't panic and sell your investments during a market downturn, which is financially catastrophic, then the irrational cash buffer might actually produce better outcomes over time. The best financial plan is one you follow. The optimal plan you abandon is worse than the suboptimal plan you maintain. This means your emotional and psychological tolerance for risk matters just as much as any financial model. Know thyself. Be honest about what you can tolerate. And build a plan around that reality rather than around some ideal of perfect rationality. Part 12. Surprise: one of the most dangerous assumptions in personal finance is the idea that the future will look like the past. Housel dedicates a chapter to dismantling this. The biggest economic events in history, the ones that reshaped entire financial landscapes, were almost universally unpredicted. No major financial institution predicted the 2008 housing crisis. No mainstream economist saw COVID-19's economic impact coming. The Great Depression wasn't predicted. The dot-com bubble wasn't widely anticipated. Again and again, the most consequential events were the ones nobody saw coming. This has huge implications for financial planning. If the future is genuinely unpredictable, not just uncertain, but genuinely full of events that have no historical precedent, then planning should account for surprise. Your financial plan should be able to survive things that have never happened before. This means don't be too leveraged. Don't bet everything on a single outcome. Don't assume that because something has worked for the last 20 years it will work for the next 20. Build in margin. Build in flexibility. The plan that survives a world you didn't predict is more valuable than the plan that would be optimal in a world that never materializes. Part 13. Room for error. Tightly connected to the previous chapter, Housel argues that the most important financial planning principle isn't maximizing expected returns. It's ensuring survival. He uses the analogy of a bridge. Engineers don't design bridges to hold exactly the maximum weight they expect them to carry. They design them to hold significantly more, sometimes double or triple the expected load. This margin of safety exists because reality is unpredictable. Materials have flaws. Conditions change. Calculations contain errors. The safety margin is the buffer between a bad day and a catastrophe. Your financial life needs the same kind of buffer. Not because you expect disaster, but because disaster is possible in ways you can't predict. And the cost of running out of money is catastrophic in a way that the cost of having slightly less return is not. This means saving more than you technically need to. It means carrying some cash even when the market seems strong. It means avoiding the kind of leverage that makes you vulnerable to a single bad outcome. It means building a life where you could survive a significant financial shock without your entire plan collapsing. The people who get into serious financial trouble are almost always the ones who had no margin. They were carrying maximum debt, investing maximally, spending to the edge of their income. When anything unexpected happened, there was no buffer. One job loss, one medical bill, one market correction, and everything fell apart. Don't be that person. Even if it means lower returns in the good years, give yourself room to survive the bad ones. Part 14. You'll change. Here's something we're all terrible at: predicting what we'll want in the future. Housel introduces what psychologists call the end of history illusion, the documented human tendency to recognize that we've changed dramatically in the past while simultaneously believing we won't change much in the future. We look at who we were 10 years ago and shake our heads at our old preferences, relationships, and beliefs. And then we look forward and assume the person we are today is basically who we'll be. We're almost always wrong. The 25-year-old who plans to retire at 40 and travel the world might, by 40, have 3 kids and not want to travel at all. The The person who builds a career in finance for the status and money might, at 45, desperately want to do something meaningful and low-paying. The couple who plans to live in a big city forever might, after having children, decide they want a backyard in the suburbs. This matters financially because we make decisions based on projected future preferences, long-term financial commitments, career paths, living situations, without acknowledging that we might be completely different people when those decisions mature. Housel's advice isn't to avoid long-term planning. It's to build flexibility into it. Avoid the most extreme versions of any financial commitment. Don't chain your future self to choices your current self makes. Accept that the plan might need to change, and make sure it can. Part 15. Nothing's free. Every financial reward has a price. The mistake most people make is thinking the price is something they can avoid if they're clever enough. Housel uses market volatility as his central example. The stock market over long periods produces remarkable returns. But those returns come with a price, significant, terrifying volatility. Crashes of 30, 40, 50% happen. They feel awful. They trigger the deepest financial fears. Many investors see this volatility as a fine, a punishment for a mistake, something to be avoided or minimized. But Housel argues it's actually an admission fee. It's the cost of the ticket to the long-term returns. And if you want the returns, you have to pay the fee. The investors who try to avoid the fee, who time the market, who move to cash during downturns, who try to be clever, mostly end up with worse outcomes than the investors who just accepted the volatility and stayed the course. This applies beyond investing. Every worthwhile financial pursuit has a price. Building a business has a price. Years of uncertainty, risk, and often personal financial sacrifice. Achieving financial independence has a price. Spending less than you earn for a very long time, often foregoing things your peers are buying. You can decide whether the price is worth it, but you can't decide not to pay it. The people who get into trouble financially are often the ones who wanted the reward without acknowledging the price, and then were blindsided when the bill arrived. Part 16. You and Me. Playing different games, one of the most practically useful insights in the book. People at different financial stages with different goals are playing fundamentally different games. And catastrophe happens when they start copying each other. Here's the scenario. A day trader with a short time horizon looks at a stock, decides it's overvalued, but that momentum will keep it rising for another few months, and buys it planning to sell before it corrects. That's a completely rational strategy for their game. But if a long-term retirement investor watches this and thinks, well, that trader is buying it, so maybe I should hold on a bit longer, they've just adopted a short-term speculator's logic into a long-term investing strategy. That's a category error. It's playing someone else's game. This happens constantly. During asset bubbles, crypto, tech stocks, housing, people who should be thinking in decades start thinking in months because they're watching short-term players win in the short term. They change their behavior based on what's working for a completely different kind of player. Know what game you're playing. Know your time horizon. Know your goals. And don't let the behavior of people playing different games influence yours. A 22-year-old retail investor and a 60-year-old retiree should not be making the same decisions, even if they're looking at the same assets. Part 17, 18, and 19. The Seduction of Pessimism and Stories We Tell Ourselves. The final substantive chapters of the book address two related ideas. Why pessimism is seductive, and why the stories we tell ourselves about our financial lives are often more powerful than the facts. On pessimism. Housel makes the observation that pessimism sounds smart. When someone predicts doom, we take them seriously. When someone predicts prosperity, we call them naive. There's an asymmetry in how we receive optimistic versus pessimistic views. But over long periods, the optimists have almost always been right. The world has gotten richer, healthier, and more connected. Economic crashes have always been followed by recoveries. Progress has a longer track record than catastrophe. This doesn't mean ignoring real risks. It means being aware that our brains are calibrated to take pessimism seriously and dismiss optimism as wishful thinking, even when optimism has, historically, been the more accurate view. On stories, we all have a narrative about who we are financially. I'm bad with money. I'm the kind of person who takes risks. People like me don't get to retire early. Money is for people who got lucky. These stories feel like descriptions of reality, but they're actually prescriptions. They shape what we try, what we believe is possible, and how we explain our outcomes to ourselves. The danger is that these stories can become self-fulfilling. The person who tells themselves they're bad with money will stop trying to get better. The person who believes wealth is only for the lucky won't take the steps available to them. Housel's implicit challenge throughout is to examine these stories, to ask whether they're actually true or whether they're just comfortable explanations for where we are. Part 20. Confessions. The final chapter is Morgan Housel's own financial plan. How does the person who wrote this book actually manage his own money? He and his wife keep a significant amount of cash, more than most financial advisors would recommend. They have no target asset allocation. They don't optimize for maximum return. They invest in low-cost index funds and have done so for years without deviation. They own their home with a mortgage, which is mathematically suboptimal but emotionally valuable. They try to save as much as they comfortably can without feeling deprived. It's a deliberately boring plan. There's nothing clever about it. No sophisticated strategies, no complex instruments, no market timing. Just consistent, patient, low-drama investing. And that, Housel says, is the point. The financial plan that actually works isn't the one that looks impressive on a spreadsheet. It's the one you can follow for decades without abandoning it when things get hard. It's the one that fits your psychology, your family, and your values, not just your projected returns. The critique. Where this book falls short now, I want to be honest with you because I think a summary that only tells you how great a book isn't actually helping you. So let's talk about where the psychology of money has real limitations, because it does. First, let's acknowledge the most obvious one. Almost everything in this book is written from the perspective of someone who has enough money to think about these things. The beautiful insight that money buys freedom lands very differently if you're living paycheck to paycheck with student debt, medical bills, and a rent increase coming next month. When Housel says spend less than you earn, that advice assumes there's something left after essentials. For a significant portion of the population, there simply isn't. Not because of bad behavior or poor psychology, but because wages are low, costs are high, and the structural reality of their situation doesn't offer much of a margin. This doesn't make the book wrong, but it does mean its advice is most applicable to people who are already in a position of some financial stability. If you're in a genuine financial crisis, the behavioral insights here are mostly unactionable. You need different resources first. Second, the book is almost entirely American in its framing. Social Security, 401(k)s, the specific tax advantages of certain investment accounts, the housing market dynamics Housel references, these are deeply particular to the United States. If you're reading this in the UK, Canada, India, or anywhere else, some of the specific advice won't translate directly. The psychological principles generalize. The practical applications often don't. Third, and this is a more substantive critique, the book is very light on specific, actionable guidance. By design, Housel is writing about psychology and behavior, not about investment strategy. That's the stated scope of the book. But there are moments where you want him to go a little further. Okay, I understand that I should save money and stay the course and not panic during crashes. But where should I invest? In what proportions? What's actually in a good index fund? How do I think about the trade-off between paying off debt and investing? Housel largely leaves these questions to other books, which is fair, but it can feel a little frustrating if you're looking for a complete roadmap. Fourth, the book has a tendency toward survivor bias in its examples. When Housel talks about staying in the market for decades and watching compound interest work its magic, the examples he uses are almost always success stories. The people who followed similar advice and had bad outcomes because they needed to access their money during a downturn, or because they faced extraordinary circumstances, or because their specific investments underperformed, appear less frequently. This creates a slightly rosier picture of long-term passive investing than the complete evidence might support. And finally, the one that's most relatable if you've ever finished a personal finance book feeling inspired and then done absolutely nothing. This book, like most books in this genre, can't solve the gap between knowing and doing. You can understand compounding, You can feel the power of Housel's ideas. You can put down this book genuinely moved and changed in your thinking. And then you can go right back to spending the way you always spent, saving the way you always saved, and behaving financially exactly the way you always did. Because knowing things and changing things are two completely different challenges. The psychology of actually changing behavior, which requires confronting habit, social pressure, structural constraints, and the friction of real life, is a harder problem than the psychology of understanding money. And Housel mostly doesn't address it. None of this means you shouldn't read the book. You absolutely should. It is, as I said at the start, one of the best personal finance books of the last decade. Its core insights are genuinely important and genuinely underrepresented in how most of us think about money. But read it knowing what it is, a set of big, important ideas that will change how you think, delivered by someone whose life circumstances made those ideas available to him in ways that aren't universal. Use it as a foundation. Let it shift your perspective. And then go find the more specific, practical resources that can help you act on what you've learned. Final thoughts: if I had to distill the psychology of money to its single most important idea, it would be this. The enemy of good financial outcomes is usually not ignorance. It's behavior. It's fear during crashes. It's greed during booms. It's the need to keep up with people whose financial game has nothing to do with yours. It's the ego that makes you want visible wealth more than actual security. It's the impatience that prevents you from letting compounding do its slow, quiet, miraculous work. You already know most of what you need to know to make good financial decisions. Spend less than you earn. Invest consistently. Don't panic. Be patient. Protect your downside. None of these are secrets. The hard part is doing them, consistently over decades, in the face of everything life throws at you. That's the psychological challenge. And that's what this book is really about. Morgan Housel didn't write a book about money. He wrote a book about human nature, told through the lens of money. And if you read it with that understanding, it will serve you well.